So imagine you have this manuscript, right? And it has 3 billion letters.
Right. A massive epic.
Exactly, this incredibly complex epic that details exactly how to build and maintain a human being.
A human genome.
Yeah. Now, imagine flipping to just a random page, right in the middle of that massive book, finding a single specific word and deleting just one letter.
Just one single letter out of billions.
Right. And in the grand scheme of 3 billion letters, a single missing character shouldn't even register. You know, you'd think the story would just, like, flow right past it.
You would certainly think so, yes.
But in human genetics, that microscopic typo, specifically on chromosome 5, it literally rewrites the entire trajectory of a life.
It's astounding, really.
It is. I mean, it causes a child's brain to just forget how to breathe in their sleep. It curves their spine. And perhaps most heartbreakingly, it traps this vibrant, deeply understanding mind inside a physical body that just refuses to speak.
It really is the ultimate biological paradox, because we are talking about an incredibly tiny, highly localized genetic deletion, but it sends these massive systemic shock waves through nearly every major system in the human body.
Which is exactly why we're doing this deep dive today.
Yeah.
And if you were listening to this right now, we have a pretty good idea of exactly who you might be.
Absolutely.
You might be a parent, maybe sitting in a hospital cafeteria right now, just staring at a freshly printed genetics report with a diagnosis you can barely even pronounce yet.
Or you might be a carer who has spent, years, maybe even decades, on this terrifying, exhausting diagnostic odyssey.
Right, finally putting a name to the challenges your child faces every single day. Or hey, maybe you're an educator preparing for an IEP meeting, a speech therapist, or just someone insanely curious about the absolute frontiers of human genetics.
Whoever you are, we are speaking directly to you today.
Exactly. We're taking this massive stack of sources. We've got clinical guidelines, genetic research papers, foundational materials from the PURA Syndrome Foundation, case studies from the Cleveland Clinic, and even the latest 2024 to 2026 therapeutic pipelines. And we are just distilling all of it.
Because, well, when you receive a medical document, it is usually so sterile.
Oh, it's just a list of things that are wrong.
Right. It's a list of deficits. It tells you what is broken, but it rarely tells you why. And it almost never tells you what to actually expect on a regular Tuesday morning in your living room.
Yeah, those resorts don't help you navigate the daily reality at all.
No, they don't. So our goal here is to take those dense, jargon-heavy medical reports and translate them into a comprehensive, empowering map of PURA syndrome.
And before we get into the microscopic details of the genetics, there is this one timeline fact here that absolutely stopped me in my tracks.
I think I know which one you're going to mention.
I mean, when we talk about conditions like Down syndrome or cystic fibrosis, there is like a century of medical literature backing them up. But PURA syndrome, doctors literally didn't even know this existed when the first iPad came out.
That is completely correct. It was officially recognized in the medical literature for the very first time on October 23, 2014.
2014, that's yesterday.
It is. A team led by Dr. David Hunt at the University of Southampton published the very first clinical paper describing the genetic mechanism. So, prior to the fall of 2014, PURA syndrome simply did not exist as a diagnosis.
So the families navigating it were just entirely in the dark.
Completely in the dark. Their children were often given these broad umbrella misdiagnoses, like severe cerebral palsy or profound autism or just generalized global developmental delay.
That is just staggering to me. I mean, we had rovers driving around on Mars, but a family could walk into a top-tier neurology clinic and be told, we have absolutely no idea why your child's brain is doing this.
It really highlights how new genomic sequencing technology is in the grand scheme of medicine.
And because it's so newly discovered, the numbers are incredibly small, right? The sources note that as of late 2024, there are only about 706 confirmed cases globally.
Yes, spread across roughly 60 countries.
And they estimate the incidence is somewhere around 1 in 1 million.
Yeah.
But if it was only discovered in 2014 and, highly advanced genetic sequencing isn't accessible everywhere in the world, I mean, there have to be thousands of people living with this right now who have no idea.
Undeniably, the true prevalence is likely much, much higher, which is exactly why understanding the specific mechanism, what is actually happening at the cellular level, is so critical.
Right, not just for the families, but for the doctors.
Exactly, for the pediatricians and neurologists who might actually be looking at a patient with PURA right now without realizing it.
Okay, so let's zoom all the way in. Let's look at the actual blueprint of this condition.
Yeah.
Deep inside our cells, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes.
Correct.
And on chromosome number 5, At a very specific address that geneticists call the 5q31.3 locus, there is the PURA gene. PURA.
Yes, which stands for purine-rich element-binding protein A.
Okay, so to understand why a mutation here is so catastrophic, you have to understand a bit about genetic architecture.
Right. You do. Normally, a gene in your DNA is broken up into different segments. You have coding regions called exons and non-coding regions called introns.
Right, so when your body reads a typical gene to make a protein, it has to edit out the introns and splice the exons together.
Exactly. It's a whole editing process.
I always think of it like a movie director taking a bunch of different scenes and editing them together to make the final film.
That's a great way to visualize it. But the PURA gene is structurally a rarity in the human genome.
Oh, so
It is a single exon gene.
wait, so there are no introns at all?
0 introns. There is no editing process whatsoever. It is just one continuous, unbroken block of biological instructions.
I have to ask, though, from an evolutionary standpoint, why would nature design it that way? If it's a single unbroken block, okay, pure alpha.
And this protein is 322 amino acids long, and its defining feature is that it contains 3 highly conserved structural regions. We call them pure repeats 1, 2, and 3.
When you say highly conserved, what does that actually mean in genetics?
It means that across millions of years of evolution, from certain bacteria to fruit flies to mice, all the way to humans, nature essentially locked this exact design in place.
Wow, so it hasn't changed across all those species.
Hardly at all. Nature decided the structure was so flawlessly adapted for its job that altering it would be incompatible with life.
Okay, so what is its job? What is this ancient, perfectly designed, pure alpha protein actually doing in our bodies?
It acts like a pair of highly specialized molecular hands. Those pure repeats allow the protein to literally grab onto specific sequences of DNA and RNA.
So it's grabbing genetic material.
Yes. Inside the nucleus of the cell, it acts as a regulator. It helps control when and how other genes are turned on and off during DNA replication.
Okay, that sounds important.
It is. But its most vital role, and the one that truly unravels the mystery of PURA syndrome, happens outside the nucleus, in the cytoplasm of your brain cells, your neurons.
Okay, this is the part of the clinical papers that honestly took me a few reads to wrap my head around. The sources talk heavily about mRNA transport.
Yes, that is the core mechanism.
Let me try to visualize this. If the neuron is a giant manufacturing plant, the nucleus is the boss's office in the center, right? Where the master blueprints, the DNA, are locked in a safe.
Correct.
But the actual manufacturing, the building of new neural connections and memories, that happens miles away at the loading docks, which would be the synapses at the very edges of the cell.
That is a very solid foundation for the concept. The brain relies heavily on something called local protein synthesis.
Local protein synthesis, meaning they build it on site.
Precisely. For a brain to learn, to adapt, to form a memory, it has to physically change the structure of the synapse. It cannot wait for a protein to be manufactured way back in the center of the cell and then slowly drift outward.
That would take too long.
Far too long. It needs the raw instructions delivered directly to the synapse so the proteins can be built on-site in milliseconds, right when they are needed.
So the boss's office makes a photocopy of the blueprint. That's the messenger RNA, the mRNA.
Yes.
But that blueprint can't just float to the loading dock on its own. It needs a courier. It needs a delivery truck. So is the pure alpha protein the delivery truck?
It is the delivery truck, the driver, and the navigation system all rolled into one.
Oh, wow.
Pure alpha grabs the mRNA blueprint using those specific per repeats we talked about, packages it safely, and actively transports it all the way down the long arms of the neuron, the dendrites.
And then it drops it off at the synapse.
Exactly.
Okay, so if you are a child with a mutation in the PURA gene, what goes wrong with the truck? The clinical papers frequently mention a very specific common variant called P233del.
Yes, that's a very prevalent mutation.
And in that variant, just a single amino acid, a phenylalanine, is deleted. If you just lose that one tiny piece, does the truck just get lost?
It's much worse than getting lost. That specific missing amino acid completely distorts the physical shape of PURA-PET3. It breaks the beta sheet structure of the protein.
So the structure itself collapses.
Going back to your truck analogy, it isn't just a navigation error. The cargo bay of the truck is crushed. The protein might still be physically floating around in the cell, but its hands are broken.
So it cannot bind to the mRNA blueprint at all.
Exactly. It can't pick up the cargo.
So the synapse, the loading dock, is just sitting there waiting for instructions on how to build a neural connection.
Yeah.
And the instructions never arrive. The brain's construction project just stalls.
Precisely. It stalls out. And this is where we have to introduce a crucial genetic term, haploinsufficiency.
Haploinsufficiency. Okay, unpack that for us.
Well, you inherit two copies of the PURA gene, one from your mother and one from your father.
Right.
In almost all cases of PURA syndrome, the parents are genetically typical. The mutation is what we call de novo.
Meaning it's new?
Yes, a spontaneous random typo that happened in the sperm or the egg right at conception. The child ends up with one perfectly normal copy of the PURA gene and one mutated copy.
Or sometimes a microdeletion where the entire gene is just missing from one chromosome, right?
Exactly.
But wait, if they still have one perfectly normal copy, shouldn't that be enough? I mean, we have two kidneys and you can live perfectly fine with one. Why can't the brain just rely on the good copy of the gene?
It's a logical question, but it comes down to the massive, staggering demand of a developing fetal brain. Haploinsufficiency literally means half is not enough.
So one gene can't keep up with the quota.
Not even close. The single working copy of the gene is churning out normal pure alpha protein as fast as it can, but it simply cannot meet the quota required to build millions of synapses a minute. The supply chain collapses.
And because the supply chain is compromised from the very first moments of fetal brain development, this isn't a condition that slowly reveals itself over a few years, like some forms of autism or learning disability.
No, it is immediate.
The developmental stall hits a brick wall the very second that child is born and separated from the mother's life support.
Yes. The transition from the womb to the delivery room is an acute, incredibly dangerous medical crisis for a child with PURA syndrome.
And for parents listening, you likely remember this period vividly. It's usually a blur of alarms, specialists, and an immediate, prolonged admission to the NICU.
The clinical literature outlines a very specific triad of symptoms that define this neonatal period. It's almost universal in these babies.
Okay, what's the triad?
Profound hypotonia, respiratory insufficiency, and severe feeding difficulties.
Let's break those down, starting with the hypotonia, because I think this is where a lot of early misdiagnoses happen. The clinical term is often translated to terrified parents as floppy baby syndrome.
Yes, that's the colloquial term often used. Hypotonia refers to an abnormally low level of muscle tone.
Right, because when you pick up a typical healthy newborn, you feel a natural resistance, don't you?
Exactly. They pull their arms and legs inward. They have a certain tension to their bodies.
But a baby born with PURA syndrome.
They will often feel completely limp. They cannot lift their head, their arms hang loosely, and they lie completely flat against the mattress. The text notes this severe hypotonia is present in over 95% of cases.
Now, let me challenge something here, because my immediate intuition, and probably the intuition of a lot of parents, is that if a baby's muscles are completely limp, the muscles themselves must be diseased.
Right, you think so?
You immediately think of muscular dystrophy or something peripheral. But the sources are incredibly specific here. The muscles are completely fine.
This is perhaps one of the most vital diagnostic distinctions a neurologist has to make in the NICU. We have to separate peripheral muscle weakness from central hypertonia.
Central meaning the brain.
Yes. In a peripheral disease like spinal muscular atrophy, the muscle fibers themselves are degenerating, or the nerves directly connecting to the muscles are dying.
But in PURA?
In PURA syndrome, the muscle tissue is structurally pristine. The peripheral nerves are perfectly intact. The problem is central.
Because of the missing pure alpha protein.
Exactly. The brain, lacking that vital protein, is failing to send the constant low-level electrical hum that tells the muscles, hey, stay slightly tense.
So it's like having a perfectly wired lamp with a brand new light bulb plugged into a working outlet, but the power plant 10 miles away is just refusing to send electricity down the grid.
That is exactly it. And clinically, a doctor can actually prove this right at the bedside.
How?
Despite the fact that the baby is entirely limp, if a neurologist taps the infant's knee with a reflex hammer, the deep tendon reflexes are typically preserved. The leg will kick.
Oh, wow. So that single kick is a massive clue.
It is huge. It tells the doctor the peripheral wiring works. It points the investigation away from the muscles and directly toward the central brain.
And it differentiates it from other severe hypotonia conditions like Prader-Willi syndrome.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, that failure of the brain's power plant doesn't just affect the arms and legs. It affects the core automatic survival functions.
Let's talk about the respiratory distress then, because the sources state that more than 50% of these infants experience recurrent apnea. They literally just stop breathing.
Apnea is terrifying, but in PURA syndrome, it is uniquely complicated because it happens on two entirely different fronts.
Right, the sources mention central apnea and obstructive apnea.
Yes, central apnea goes back to the power plant failure. The respiratory centers in the brainstem, which is an area where PUR alpha is normally heavily utilized, they just fail to send the take a breath command.
So the baby doesn't struggle or choke.
Yeah.
Their brain just simply forgets to trigger the lungs.
Precisely. And then compounding that, you have the obstructive sleep apnea.
Which is related to the hypotonia we just talked about.
Yes, the floppy muscles, the muscles of your mouth, your throat, your pharynx, those need tone to stay open.
Right.
When a baby with PURA relaxes or enters a sleep cycle, that low tone allows the physical airway to literally collapse inward, blocking the flow of oxygen.
So the baby is fighting a war on two fronts. The brain forgetting to breathe, and the physical airway caving in when it does try to take a breath.
Which explains why so many of these neonates require mechanical ventilation, CPAP machines, or supplemental oxygen for months.
And tied directly into that low muscle tone in the throat is the third part of the crisis triad: dysphagia, or severe feeding difficulties.
Swallowing is arguably one of the most complex, highly coordinated muscular actions a human being performs.
I mean, we take it for granted, but it's a lot of muscles working together.
It requires the precise, split-second timing of dozens of muscles in the mouth and throat to coordinate sucking, swallowing, and breathing.
And if any part of that sequence is delayed or lacks tone...
Disaster strikes.
Because if a baby with PURA tries to bottle feed or breastfeed, the liquid doesn't go smoothly down the esophagus. It slips down the wrong pipe, which is called aspiration. Right?
Yes, aspiration.
And it goes straight into the lungs, leading to aspiration pneumonia, which can be fatal.
Exactly. So the medical intervention in the NICU must be rapid. The sources indicate that almost all of these neonates require temporary nutritional support through a nasogastric tube.
An NG tube, the one that goes down the nose and directly into the stomach.
Yes. And for many children, if the swallow study shows that the dysphagia is chronic and not improving, the family has to make the difficult decision to undergo surgery for a G-tube.
A gastrostomy tube placed directly through the abdominal wall into the stomach.
Which, while very daunting for a parent to manage initially, is absolutely life-saving. It removes the risk of pneumonia and guarantees the child gets the exact calories they need to grow.
Now, amidst the terrifying chaos of ventilators and feeding tubes, the foundation materials and case reports highlight these incredibly specific, almost bizarre little features that parents noticed.
Yes, the clinical phenomenology here is fascinating.
Things that, on their own, seem meaningless, but together paint a picture of total brainstem dysregulation. Take neonatal hypothermia, for example.
Right. The autonomic nervous system, the part of the deep brain that unconsciously controls your core body temperature, is out of sync.
So these babies often cannot generate or maintain their own body heat.
They frequently require specialized warming incubators long after a typical preemie would be in an open crib.
And then there are the hiccups. This blew my mind reading the sources.
The hiccups are a very well-documented anomaly.
Several mothers in the Global Patient Registries reported feeling excessive, almost violent hiccups while the baby was still in utero. And then once the baby was born, continuous, intense bouts of hiccuping. Why does that happen?
Well, a hiccup is essentially a sudden involuntary spasm of the diaphragm muscle, and that spasm is coordinated by a reflex arc right there in the brainstem.
So it is just another subtle flashing warning light pointing toward early brainstem misfiring caused by the lack of PUR alpha.
Exactly. Put yourself in the shoes of a neonatologist trying to solve this puzzle before the genetic sequencing comes back.
Yeah, you have a baby who is entirely floppy but has normal reflexes, a baby whose brain forgets to breathe, a baby who can't coordinate a swallow, can't hold their body temperature, and is hiccuping constantly.
It is an absolute neurological storm.
But here is the critical pivot in the PURA narrative, and I think it's something families really need to hear.
Yes, regarding the stabilization.
Right, while that first year is a harrowing marathon of survival and acute medical management, the literature clearly notes that the respiratory and temperature issues often stabilize as the child grows.
They do. The central apneas tend to decrease significantly after age 1. The child survives the immediate crisis.
But the underlying structural differences in how their brain was wired in the womb have now set the stage for their long-term developmental reality.
The physical crisis cools down, and the developmental reality sets in.
Which brings us to an incredibly emotional and complex part of the journey. The communication chasm, receptive versus expressive language.
As the infant grows into a toddler, the neurodevelopmental trajectory becomes undeniable.
The clinical literature states, basically without exception, that all known cases of PURA syndrome feature moderate to severe intellectual disability and global developmental delay.
Yes. And the motor delays are profound. The Foundation texts note that many individuals with PURA never achieve independent walking. They remain reliant on wheelchairs for their entire lives.
And for those who do eventually learn to walk, the text notes it happens very late, usually somewhere between ages 3 and 10.
And when they do walk, it is almost always described as a broad-based, unsteady gait.
Because we have to remember that central hypotonia from birth doesn't just vanish, does it?
No, it doesn't. Their core muscle tone remains low throughout their life.
So walking with a wide, broad-based stance is actually a brilliant biomechanical adaptation by the child.
It really is. They are actively widening their base of support to maintain their center of gravity, simply because their core muscles aren't firing strongly enough to keep them perfectly upright.
But if you talk to parents, and this is heavily reflected in the PURA syndrome foundation materials, the physical motor delays, the fact that they might not walk, that is often not the deepest source of grief or frustration.
No, it is usually the communication.
The true heartbreak and the true challenge is the stark, massive discrepancy between what the child understands and what they can express.
The vast majority of individuals with PURA are completely non-speaking. They may never produce meaningful spoken words.
But, and I want to emphasize this heavily for anyone interacting with a child who has PURA, they possess a profound, deep, trapped understanding of their environment.
Yes. In neurology and speech pathology, we call this the gap between receptive language and expressive language.
Okay, define those for us.
Receptive language is what you take in, what you hear, what you comprehend. Expressive language is your physical ability to output a response.
Right. And parents, therapists, and clinicians universally report that these children have excellent receptive skills relative to their expressive output.
They follow multi-step commands, they understand the punchlines of jokes, they are incredibly attuned to the emotional temperature of a room.
It's like, let me try a different analogy here. Imagine a brilliant composer. They have entire symphonies playing in their head. The sheet music is perfectly written in their mind.
That's their receptive language.
Exactly. But when they sit down to play it for you, the piano they are forced to use has severed strings and missing keys. The music is in there, but the physical machinery required to broadcast it is fundamentally broken.
That is a highly accurate representation. The cognitive pathways for sensory input, emotional processing, and comprehension are functioning at a significantly higher level than the specific motor pathways required for vocalization.
Because speaking is a physical act.
A highly complex one. It requires incredibly precise, coordinated physical movement of the vocal cords, tongue, and lips.
So if you are a parent sitting in an early intervention meeting, or you are a speech-language pathologist working with a child who understands everything you say but cannot move their vocal cords to reply, how on earth do you measure progress?
It's very difficult.
What does a victory look like when traditional talking is completely off the table?
It requires a complete paradigm shift in how we view communication. This is where the early, aggressive, and consistent implementation of AAC becomes the absolute cornerstone of their education.
AAC stands for augmentative and alternative communication, right?
Yes. And progress here is beautifully, frustratingly nonlinear.
What do you mean by that?
Well, a victory might be a 2-year-old learning to make a very specific, intentional vocal grunt just to get your attention.
Oh, I see.
It might be a child learning basic keyword sign, or simply learning to reach out and touch a physical object to indicate they want it.
And the sources emphasize repeatedly how social these kids are. The text literally describes the typical PURA behavioral profile as very social, friendly, and affectionate.
They are widely known for giving incredible hugs.
Yeah. They desperately want to participate in the human experience. They aren't withdrawn. They are trapped.
Absolutely. So the goal of speech therapy shifts entirely from trying to force spoken syllables to building alternative bridges out of that chasm.
And in the early years, this often involves low-tech options, right? Like therapists will create robust, symbol-based picture boards where the child can simply point to a picture of an apple or a picture of a playground.
Yes, but pointing requires fine motor control, which we know is impaired by the hypotonia.
Right. So what happens when they physically cannot isolate a pointer finger to tap a picture?
This is where modern technology has revolutionized the landscape for rare diseases. As they grow and their specific motor capabilities are assessed by occupational therapists, they often transition to high-tech AAC.
Like an iPad or something.
For some, yes, it might be a touchscreen tablet with specialized software like Proloquo 2Go, where they can hit larger buttons to build sentences.
But for those whose gross and fine motor delays are too severe to even reliably tap a screen,
Then the gold standard is now eye gaze technology.
this is incredible tech. I really want to spend a second explaining this because it's not just a webcam.
No, it's highly sophisticated.
An eye gaze device uses infrared lights that bounce off the child's cornea. The computer's camera tracks the microscopic movements of the pupil.
Correct.
So the child looks at a specific word or symbol on the screen, say the word hungry, and they have to hold their gaze exactly on that spot for a set amount of time called dwell time.
Usually just a fraction of a second.
Right, and then the computer speaks the word out loud. It's basically giving them a voice through their eyes.
It is, but we have to recognize the immense cognitive and physical load this places on the child. Using an eye gaze device isn't like you or me glancing at a smartphone.
It's a lot harder.
Much harder. The child has to hold their head steady, overcome their underlying muscle weakness, visually track across a complex screen of symbols, make a cognitive choice, and then maintain an intensely focused stare.
All while filtering out the distractions of a noisy classroom or the living room.
Exactly. It is exhausting work.
But providing that tool, fighting the insurance companies and the school districts to fund that specific expensive device is not a luxury.
Not at all.
It is a fundamental, non-negotiable quality of life issue. Because what happens when you have a functioning, understanding mind trapped in a body that cannot communicate its needs?
The frustration turns inward or it explodes outward.
Like if they're in physical pain and can't say it.
Exactly. The sheer, terrifying helplessness of not being able to tell your mother that your stomach hurts or that a tag on your shirt is scratching you, it leads to immense behavioral challenges.
So we see self-injurious behaviors, intense meltdowns.
And aggression, simply as a desperate outlet for unexpressed communication.
It makes complete sense. I mean, if I dropped you in a foreign country and you understood the language perfectly, but I taped your mouth shut and tied your hands, you would eventually scream or lash out just to prove you existed.
It's a very human response to an impossible situation.
But what makes this situation so much more volatile for a child with PRA is that this behavioral frustration is often compounded by the brain's actual physical electrical system beginning to misfire.
Yes, the storm returns.
Which brings us to the neurology of PURA.
This is perhaps the most clinically complex area of long-term management. The genetic literature and global clinical consensus show that over 50% of PRA patients will develop epilepsy.
Over half. And unlike some severe genetic epilepsies that appear on day one in the NICU, the epilepsy in PURA syndrome typically has a delayed, insidious onset.
It usually emerges between the ages of 2 and 5 years old.
It's just devastating timing. Just when a family thinks they have survived the respiratory apneas, they've gotten the G-tube placed, they're settling into a rhythm with preschool and AC, this new, invisible storm hits.
And the sources make it clear that the epilepsy associated with PRA is rarely simple. We aren't talking about a kid just spacing out for a few seconds.
No, the seizure semiology, which is the clinical term for the specific types and physical manifestations of the seizures they experience, is complex and highly evolutional.
Many patients present initially with myoclonic jerks.
What do those look like?
They are sudden, lightning-fast, involuntary muscle twitches. To a parent, it might just look like a violent shudder, or the child's head suddenly dropping forward.
But these myoclonic jerks can occur dozens, sometimes hundreds of times a day.
They can. And every time that happens, it's an electrical short circuit in the brain that disrupts whatever the child was trying to learn or process.
But it doesn't stop at myoclonic jerks. The sources note that these often progress into generalized tonic-clonic seizures.
These are what the general public used to call grand mal seizures.
Right, a complete loss of consciousness, stiffening of the body, and full rhythmic convulsing.
And in some of the most severe cases documented, the epilepsy evolves into a catastrophic diagnosis, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome.
Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, or LGS. The sources emphasize how brutal this is.
LGS is one of the most devastating, notoriously difficult to treat forms of childhood-onset epilepsy. Biologically, it is characterized by multiple different types of daily seizures, including drop attacks where the child loses all muscle tone and collapses.
But the true hallmark of LGS is a very specific, chaotic electrical pattern on an EEG, right?
Yes, it's called slow spike and wave. When a child's brain enters this pattern, especially during sleep, they are completely robbed of the ability to consolidate memories or learn new skills.
The constant electrical static just drowns out the brain's attempts to build those synaptic connections we talked about earlier.
Exactly. LGS carries a very high risk of severe developmental regression.
And here's a deeply frustrating point made repeatedly in the clinical papers. The epilepsy associated with PURA is notoriously refractory.
It is drug resistant.
Yes. Because the PURA mutation is present in every single cell of the brain from conception, the electrical instability isn't localized. The structural deficits in the dendrites are global.
Therefore, many individuals require polytherapy.
Meaning they are prescribed a heavy cocktail of 2, 3, or even 4 different anti-seizure medications at maximum doses.
And they still experience breakthrough seizures.
I want to make sure I understand the surgical implications of that. Because in some cases of severe epilepsy, if the drugs aren't working, I know neurosurgeons will go in and literally cut out the piece of the brain that is misfiring, like removing scar tissue or a focal lesion.
Receptive surgery, yes.
Why can't they do that here?
Because there is no single bad part of the brain to cut out. Surgical resection relies on the rest of the brain being healthy enough to take over the lost function. In PURA syndrome, the lack of pure alpha protein means the entire cerebral cortex, the whole network, is fundamentally hyperexcitable and structurally immature. Resection is simply not a viable option.
So neurologists are left trying to constantly adjust the medication dials.
Or perhaps trying the ketogenic diet, which has shown some efficacy in altering brain metabolism.
Or surgically implanting a vagus nerve stimulator, a VNS device, in the chest that shoots regular electrical pulses up into the neck to try and break the seizure cycle.
Exactly. It is a constant, terrifying battle for seizure control.
Now, amidst this discussion of epilepsy, we have to talk about a completely different neurological phenomenon that occurs in PURA syndrome.
The startle response.
Yes, and I think this is one of the most vital aha moments in all of the source material. We need to talk about non-epileptic movements. Because if you are a parent and you see your child suddenly violently stiffen and jerk, your brain immediately screams, "Seizure!"
Of course it does.
But the experts highlight a hallmark feature called the pathological startle response.
This is a defining, incredibly specific feature of PURA syndrome. A pathological startle is an exaggerated, massive, prolonged physical reaction to a completely benign, sudden acoustic or tactile stimulus.
Like what?
A dog barks loudly, a sibling drops a book on the floor, or someone unexpectedly touches the child on the shoulder from behind.
And what happens?
The child's entire body goes into a massive, stiffening spasm that looks to the naked eye almost indistinguishable from a myoclonic or tonic seizure.
Okay, let me try to picture this. It's like a car alarm, right?
Okay, let's hear it.
A car alarm, it's supposed to go off if someone smashes the window. But in this case, the alarm sensitivity dial has been cranked up so high that a single leaf falling on the hood causes the alarm to trigger.
That's very apt.
And the wiring is tied straight into the engine, so the whole car shakes. The brain's sensory filtering system, the part that tells us to ignore a door slamming, is completely overwhelmed,
resulting in a massive dump of excitatory neurotransmitters. That is a brilliant refinement of the analogy. Yes, the sensory filter is broken, leading to a massive motor output.
And for parents, witnessing this has to be traumatizing. If you see your child jerking every time the phone rings, your immediate fear is that they are having dozens of seizures a day and that their brain is being damaged.
This is exactly why the medical literature stresses the absolute non-negotiable necessity of serial EEGs, electroencephalograms.
But wait, explain why that distinction matters so much. A jerk is a jerk. If the brain is misfiring, doesn't it all need to be stopped?
The distinction is literally life-altering for the child's medical management. An EEG measures the electrical activity in the cortex.
Okay.
If a child has a startle response from a door slamming while hooked up to an EEG, the brainwaves will not show the rhythmic, synchronous, pathological electrical firing of a true epileptic seizure.
It will just show a startle.
It will simply show a normal brain reacting excessively to a sound. There is no electrical short circuit damaging the tissue.
Oh, wow. So if a doctor looks at that child and misdiagnoses that startle response as a seizure without verifying it on an EEG,
then the doctor increases the child's anti-epileptic medications. They add more sedating drugs to the cocktail.
Oh, no.
They drug a child heavily, risking further developmental delay, worsening their hypotonia, worsening their respiratory apnea, all without actually fixing the startle. You cannot drug a startle response away with seizure meds because it isn't a seizure.
That is a terrifying trap to fall into. So the treatment for the startle isn't more drugs, it's environmental management.
Precisely. It's warning the child before you touch them. It's reducing sudden auditory triggers.
And the texts note that a severe, exaggerated startle response in a neonate or infant with profound hypotonia is now considered a massive clinical red flag. If a neurologist sees that, it should point them directly toward ordering a genetic panel that includes the PURA gene.
Exactly. It is a diagnostic beacon in the muddy waters.
Okay, so we have covered the brain's structural blueprint, the terrifying neonatal physical crisis, the massive communication gap, and the electrical storms of epilepsy and startle.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But if we go back to the very beginning, we mentioned that the pure alpha protein isn't just in the brain, it is ubiquitous.
Yes. It is in the blood, the muscles, the heart, the connective tissue.
Which means the shock waves of this missing protein extend far beyond the nervous system. We have to look at the systemic, whole-body impact.
Managing PURA syndrome requires an entire multidisciplinary village of specialists because the extraneurological impacts are vast.
Let's start with the skeletal system, which takes a massive hit. The clinical consensus guidelines report that 48% of individuals with PURA develop scoliosis,
An abnormal lateral curvature of the spine. And it is often severe and progressive, frequently requiring massive spinal fusion surgeries.
The sources also detail hip dysplasia, where the hip socket doesn't fully cover the ball of the thigh bone, leading to dislocation and osteopenia.
Which is an abnormally low bone mineral density.
We are talking about bones so fragile they can experience pathological fractures just from the child being lifted or shifted in bed. But wait, connect the physiology for me. How does a gene that transports mRNA in the brain cause the spine to curve and the leg bones to become brittle?
We have to trace the causality backward. It all stems from that central hypotonia we discussed in the NICU.
The low muscle tone.
Right. Our bones are not static pillars of dead calcium. Bone is living, highly dynamic tissue. It grows dense, thick, and strong in direct response to mechanical stress and gravity.
This is known in medicine as Wolff's Law, right?
Yes, Wolff's Law. Every time a typical toddler runs across the room, jumps off a step, or stomps their feet, the physical impact sends a mechanical signal to the bone cells, the osteoblasts, telling them to lay down more calcium and build thicker bone.
Dynamic weight bearing.
Precisely. Because a child with PURA syndrome has profound motor delays, because they may be entirely non-ambulatory and reliant on a wheelchair, their skeletal system never receives that essential daily mechanical stress.
The osteoblasts aren't triggered.
No. Furthermore, remember the polytherapy for epilepsy. Many powerful anti-seizure medications act as metabolic thieves. They literally leach vitamin D and calcium out of the skeletal system, severely compounding the osteopenia.
And for the spine. I visualize the human spine as a tall, flexible tent pole.
Okay, a tent pole.
The core muscles of the back and the abdomen are the thick ropes staked tightly into the ground on all sides, holding that pole perfectly straight.
Right.
If those muscle ropes are permanently slack because of central hypotonia, the pole is inevitably going to buckle, bend, and warp under the relentless 247 weight of gravity. That's the scoliosis.
That is exactly the biomechanical reality. The skeletal deformities are a secondary, unavoidable complication of the primary neurological deficit.
And the systemic cascade doesn't stop at the skeleton. The clinical text provides increasing evidence of endocrine dysregulation, specifically involving the anterior pituitary gland at the base of the brain.
The master gland that controls the body's hormones?
Yes. This dysregulation leads to documented issues with human growth hormone, meaning endocrinologists must monitor these children for short stature and significant abnormalities in the onset of puberty.
The case studies note instances of both precocious, meaning unusually and dangerously early puberty, and significantly delayed puberty.
This endocrine failure also contributes heavily to the chronic vitamin D deficiency we just tied to the bone density issues.
And then there are the eyes. Almost universally, these children face complex ophthalmologic challenges.
Strabismus, which means crossed eyes or eyes that wander independently, is incredibly common, along with severe refractive errors like intense short-sightedness or long-sightedness.
Again, why does the eye cross? Because the extraocular muscles that hold the eyeball in perfect alignment lack the necessary tone.
And early aggressive intervention here, whether through corrective lenses, patching, or strabismus surgery, is absolutely critical. Remember our discussion on communication.
Of course.
If a child's sole method of expressive communication is going to be tracking microscopic symbols on an eye-gaze computer screen, their visual acuity needs to be as sharply corrected as medically possible.
Absolutely. And finally, we cannot ignore the gastrointestinal system.
No, we cannot. The human digestive tract is essentially one long, highly coordinated muscular tube.
It relies on a rhythmic wave of muscle contractions called peristalsis to move food from the stomach to the exit.
But intestinal hypotonia means the smooth muscle of the gut is sluggish. Severe, intractable chronic constipation is a near universal complaint among PURA caregivers.
It often requires intense daily regimens of osmotic laxatives, suppositories, and high-fiber tube feeds just to keep the child physically comfortable and out of the emergency room with a bowel obstruction.
I am listening to you list these out.
Mm-hmm.
The spine curving and requiring metal rods, the hips dislocating, the bones fracturing under minimal stress, the hormones misfiring, the eyes crossing, the relentless chronic constipation, the daily threat of seizures, the apnea. And it sounds incredibly profoundly overwhelming.
It is an immense caregiving load.
If the root cause is genetic, a broken delivery truck in every cell can, doctors even fix the scoliosis or the bone density, or are parents and medical teams just trapped in a perpetual game of whack-a-mole, treating symptoms as they pop up?
Currently, the hard reality is that it is the latter. It is entirely symptomatic management. You are constantly managing the downstream wreckage of the missing protein.
You brace the spine until it curves too far, and then you perform a massive spinal fusion.
You constantly supplement the vitamin D. You aggressively administer laxatives. You prescribe complex glasses. It is a massive, highly coordinated, exhausting daily effort.
Which transitions us perfectly into the incredibly practical, lived experience reality of this deep dive, navigating the matrix of care.
This is where theory meets reality.
Let's talk about the hospital systems and the educational systems, because stepping into either of those arenas with a PURA child requires a very specific ironclad battle plan. Let's start with the medical side, particularly regarding anesthesia.
Yes. Because of the vast array of systemic issues we just outlined, individuals with PURA will frequently require surgical intervention.
That means they will undergo general anesthesia multiple times in their lives.
But general anesthesia carries elevated, highly specific, and potentially fatal risks for this exact population. The orphan anesthesia guidelines lay out a critical framework that absolutely every anesthesiologist needs to memorize before putting a PURA patient to sleep.
I read this section of the guidelines incredibly closely, and one mandate stood out immediately. They strongly recommend a 50% reduction in the standard dosages of opioids and benzodiazepines.
50% is a massive cut.
Walk me through the physiology of why they need so much less.
It goes directly back to their baseline physiological deficits. Let's look at what opioids like fentanyl or benzodiazepines like Versed actually do.
They bind to receptors in the central nervous system to block pain and induce sedation.
But their primary side effect is respiratory depression and muscle relaxation. Now apply that to a PURA patient. These patients already have central apnea. Their brainstem already struggles to remember to breathe.
And they already have severe oropharyngeal hypotonia. Their airways are already prone to collapsing.
Exactly. If you administer a standard weight-based dose of a respiratory depressant to a child whose respiratory drive is already hanging by a thread, their system can completely irreversibly shut down.
They will experience an incredibly prolonged, dangerous recovery period where they cannot be safely taken off the ventilator.
The guidelines also strictly mandate active thermoregulation during the surgery, meaning forced air warming blankets and warmed 5E fluids.
Because we know from the neonatal period that their autonomic nervous system cannot control their core body temperature.
And perhaps most importantly for parents, scheduling procedures. The guidelines demand mandatory 24-hour post-operative inpatient monitoring.
That is crucial. There are no day surgeries for a child with PURA. You do not just take their tonsils out or check their eyes at 8 a.m. and send them home in the car by 3 p.m.
They must be admitted. They have to stay on a continuous pulse oximeter and heart monitor overnight because the risk of a delayed post-anesthetic apnea event in their sleep is exponentially high.
And the anesthesiologist must ensure the continuous, unbroken administration of the child's anti-epileptic medications. If the patient is NPO, meaning they are allowed nothing by mouth for 12 hours before surgery, those seizure medications must be converted and given intravenously.
Missing a single dose due to fasting can trigger a perioperative seizure storm. The physiological margins for error are incredibly thin.
Now, I want to address the parents listening directly for a second. We just listed off a set of highly specific, complex medical directives. It sounds like you're expected to become an expert medical project manager overnight.
You really are.
And the reality is, if you live in a smaller city or you were at a regional hospital, the local orthopedic surgeon or the on-call anesthesiologist has highly likely never heard of PURA syndrome. They haven't read the 2014 paper.
That is almost a certainty.
So you might be wondering, how do I confidently walk into a pre-op holding area and dictate a 50% opioid reduction to an anesthesiologist with 20 years of clinical experience?
It is the heaviest, most unfair burden of rare disease parenting. You are frequently forced to be the foremost expert on your child's condition in the room. You have to educate the doctors before they can treat your child.
But this is exactly where the power of organizations like the PURA Syndrome Foundation becomes your greatest weapon. Parents do not have to argue from anecdotal fear.
You can print out the peer-reviewed orphan anesthesia guidelines directly from the Foundation's medical portal, physically hand them to the surgeon and say, I know you haven't seen this condition, but this document is the international clinical consensus authored by top geneticists.
It provides the unassailable medical backing necessary to advocate effectively and safely.
And that intense project management, that relentless advocacy, does not stop at the sliding doors of the hospital. It carries directly over into the educational system.
The sources outline a very rigorous, necessary educational pathway, particularly focusing on the U.S. system, because early intervention is everything.
It usually starts with transitioning out of home-based therapies and fighting for placement in specialized developmental preschools around age 3 to 5.
Yes, the focus heavily shifts to the legal framework of education. Parents must secure an individualized education plan, or an IEP, through their local public school district under the IDA law.
And an IEP for a child with PURA is not a simple document. It is a legally binding contract that must detail every single accommodation.
What does that actually look like in practice for a child with this level of complexity?
It means sitting across a table from school district administrators and justifying exactly why your child needs a dedicated one-on-one paraprofessional for safety due to the startle response and drop seizures.
It means arguing for the specific speech therapy minutes required to program and train the child on a $15,000 eye gaze AAC device.
It means mandating physical therapy for mobility, occupational therapy for feeding safely, and ensuring there is a trained nurse on campus who has a specific seizure rescue medication protocol in place.
And we know school districts are chronically underfunded. They will push back. Parents have to bring letters from their neurologists, data from their private therapists, and fight for every single minute of support their child is legally entitled to receive until they age out of the school system at 21.
And simultaneously, they have to navigate enrolling in state programs like the Developmental Disabilities Administration, the DDA, to secure waiver funding for home modifications, respite care, and eventually adult day programs.
It is a marathon. It is a grueling 247 administrative job layered on top of the already exhausting physical caregiving.
And it is a marathon that does not magically end when childhood ends. Which leads us into the final horizon of our map today: adulthood and the absolute cutting-edge future of therapy.
This is a critical perspective shift. Because PURI was only identified in 2014, the initial rush of medical literature was heavily, understandably focused on diagnosing babies in the NICU and managing young children.
But we must clearly state, PURA syndrome is fundamentally a neurodevelopmental disorder. It is not a neurodegenerative disorder.
Meaning they don't go backwards.
Exactly. That is a massive, crucial point of hope for newly diagnosed families. Unlike devastating degenerative conditions like Tay-Sachs disease or certain muscular dystrophies, individuals with PURI do not biologically lose the skills they have fought so hard to acquire.
The developmental progress is agonizingly slow, and the gap between them and their neurotypical peers widens as they age, but their own personal baseline remains stable or slowly improves.
The PURA Syndrome Foundation has successfully identified and connected with adults living with the syndrome in their 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Think about that. These individuals survived childhood, survived the neonatal apneas, survived the seizures, decades before science even had a name for what they were fighting.
Yes, and survival deep into adulthood is the expected medical outcome, provided that severe secondary complications like a prolonged status epilepticus seizure or a severe aspiration pneumonia are successfully managed.
However, the reality of that adulthood is that they will require 24/7 round-the-clock care for all activities of daily living, feeding, and hygiene for their entire lives.
Which is why the clinical guidelines explicitly state that transition planning for adulthood cannot wait until they are 18. It must begin by age 12.
Parents have to start wrapping their heads around the legalities of adult guardianship, securing medical powers of attorney, and making the notoriously terrifying jump from pediatric neurologists, who are used to complex genetics, to adult neurologists, who often are not.
And they must also prepare for the behavioral profile to shift as the child ages into a teenager and an adult. While they retain that core loving social personality, the influx of adult hormones combined with the ongoing communication barrier introduces new challenges.
Severe anxiety often emerges, triggered by sensory overload or unexpected changes in routine. Sensory-seeking behaviors like intense hand-flapping, rocking, or hand-biting become much more pronounced as they try to regulate their nervous system.
And we touched on this earlier, the self-injury. When you are a 25-year-old adult experiencing adult emotions, adult physical pains, adult frustrations, but you are still trapped behind an AAC device that might not have the vocabulary for what you are feeling, the barrier can lead to aggression or self-harm simply as an explosive outlet.
Consistent, evolving AAC support and dedicated sensory regulation spaces are lifelong necessities, not just cute childhood interventions.
But as we look to that long horizon, the narrative of PURA syndrome is undergoing a radical, breathtaking acceleration. Between 2024 and 2026, there has been an absolute explosion of preclinical research.
The scientific community is moving rapidly beyond just identifying the spelling error in the gene and managing the downstream symptoms. They are entering the realm of targeted genetic therapeutics.
This is the science fiction part of the research papers that is actively becoming reality in labs right now. In May 2025, there was a landmark collaboration between the Jackson Laboratory, one of the premier genetics labs in the world, and a dedicated nonprofit called Jack's Tomorrow.
They successfully developed a robust, reliable knockout mouse model for PURA syndrome.
This is a monumental achievement. Utilizing CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology, scientists were able to act like molecular surgeons. They went into a mouse embryo and precisely cut and deleted a portion of one of the PURA alleles.
They essentially recreated the exact human state of haploinsufficiency inside a mouse, and the resulting mice exhibited the exact foundational physiological features of the human syndrome. The severe motor deficits, the profound hypotonia, the fatal seizures.
It's incredible from a scientific standpoint, but for a parent listening, why is having a sick mouse in a lab in Maine so important to their child's future?
Because a reliable, genetically accurate animal model is the ultimate biological proving ground. Before the FDA will ever allow a scientist to test a radical new gene therapy or a novel pharmaceutical compound on a human child, you have to definitively prove that it is safe and that it works in a complex, living mammalian system.
You cannot test a complex epilepsy drug in a flat petri dish of cells. You need a whole breathing organism with a functioning brain structure, a liver to metabolize the drug, and a nervous system to measure the response.
These CRISPR mouse models, combined with patient-derived cell lines housed in the Global Biobank, allow researchers at places like the Florey Institute in Australia to rapidly screen thousands of potential compounds.
It is literally like crowdsourcing a map of a newly discovered continent. The Global Patient Registry, which is managed alongside the University of Southampton, tracks the real-world natural history of the patients.
The biobank holds their physical donated cells. The mouse models provide the active testing ground for drugs.
And all of this massive infrastructure is geared toward taking advantage of a very specific recent regulatory change. The FDA recently introduced a plausible mechanism route specifically designed for individualized, ultra-rare disease drugs.
Because there are only 700 known PRA patients globally, a pharmaceutical company cannot run a traditional 10,000-person, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial. The math makes it impossible.
But the FDA now allows that if you have a deep, proven understanding of the genetic mechanism, a robust natural history tracking the disease from a registry, and solid efficacy data from an animal model, you can accelerate targeted gene therapies into human trials much, much faster.
So let me ask you the million-dollar question. The question every parent reading those research updates is secretly asking. If a child's brain has already developed from conception, through the traumatic birth, through early childhood, building trillions of synapses without enough pure alpha protein, what exactly is the realistic hope with these future gene therapies? Are scientists hoping to inject a viral vector, replace the missing gene, and actually reverse the structural damage? Will a nonverbal teenager receive a therapy and suddenly start speaking in full sentences?
As experts, we have to manage expectations with deep compassion and scientific honesty. It is highly unlikely that a gene therapy administered later in life will reverse the structural, macro-developmental deficits that occurred while the brain was forming in the womb. The architectural foundation of the house is already poured and set.
However, let's go back to our analogy of the delivery truck at the synapse. The need for local protein synthesis, the delivery of mRNA to build new memories, to learn, to adapt, that is not a one-time event in the womb. That is an ongoing, dynamic, lifelong biological process.
The loading dock is still open for business.
Exactly. If a future therapy can successfully upregulate the healthy copy of the PURA gene to produce more pure alpha protein, or use a viral vector to deliver functional pure alpha directly to the cells, the goal isn't necessarily to magically rewire the whole structural brain.
The profound, life-altering goal is to stabilize the electrical system enough to stop the catastrophic seizures entirely. The goal is to improve synaptic plasticity just enough so that learning to use that eye gaze AC device becomes 10 times easier and faster.
The goal is to improve the smooth muscle tone just enough to end the agonizing gastrointestinal blockages, or to give the core muscles enough strength to prevent the spine from curving further, avoiding a spinal fusion.
It is about drastically, fundamentally improving the daily quality of life and removing the medical trauma, not erasing the individual's underlying neurodiversity.
That is a profound, incredibly hopeful shift in perspective. To think about the timeline here. From a family sitting in a dark, lonely room in 2013 with a child who had a mystery illness and no hope, to an empowered, globally connected community driving actual, tangible, CRISPR-based scientific breakthroughs in less than a single decade.
It is a stunning testament to the sheer, relentless willpower of rare disease parents who refuse to accept "we don't know" as a final answer, combined with the incredible, accelerating pace of modern genomics.
As we wrap up this deep dive into PRA syndrome, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time earlier talking about the pathological startle response, how a child with PRA reacts with an overwhelming, massive, full-body electrical mobilization to a single, unexpected stimulus. It's a hyper-awareness, an exaggerated response of the nervous system to something dropping in their environment.
Yes, a complete, uninhibited systemic reaction.
What if society's response to rare diseases mirrored that pathological startle? Imagine a world where the healthcare system, the educational system, and the government funding bodies exhibited a hyper-awareness to vulnerability.
That would be revolutionary.
Imagine a massive, immediate, overwhelming mobilization of resources, therapies, and emotional support the very second. A rare diagnosis like PURA was handed to a family in a hospital cafeteria. Instead of forcing exhausted, traumatized parents to fight a war for every single inch of support battling insurance for an eye gaze device, fighting the school district for IEP accommodations, arguing with surgeons over anesthetic guidelines. What if the system startled into action for them?
That vision, a system that supports rather than obstructs, is exactly the world that rare disease patient advocacy groups are trying to build every single day.
If you are a parent or carer, and you want to be part of building that world, or if you simply want to continue your learning journey and connect with families who truly understand what Tuesday morning looks like in your house, we highly, highly encourage you to explore the PURA Syndrome Foundation at purasyndrome.org.
And if you are located in the UK, look into Swan syndromes without a name and aggressively seek out your regional genetics resources.
The science is moving incredibly fast, the research pipeline is open, and the community is stronger, louder, and more connected than ever before. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.